Structure is everything. All right, let's get right into it. We're not talking about loose guidelines or some friendly best practices today. No, we're talking about a rigid, non-negotiable set of architectural rules. This is the blueprint for excellent software, where discipline is what separates good from great.
Every solid building starts with a foundation. And in our software architecture, that foundation rests on two massive pillars: layered architecture and separation of concerns. Get these right, and the whole thing stands strong.
So, our first pillar, architectural rule 1, is all about layered architecture. Think of this as the master plan for the whole application. It's not a suggestion, it's a mandate. The system must be divided into distinct, clearly separated layers. This is how we bring order to the chaos right from the start. So, what do these layers actually look like? Well, AR1 is super specific about it. You've got your front end, the middle layer for all the application logic, the back end, a dedicated layer for database connection, the API, a totally separate configuration layer, and of course, any MCP integration. Each one has its own job, and keeping them apart is our first line of defense against creating a mess. Now, this is where it gets really crucial. The second pillar, separation of concerns, is all about discipline. AR2 lays down the law on communication. A layer can only talk to the layer right next to it. That's it. So the front end can talk to the middle layer, sure, but there is no way it can just bypass it and talk directly to the back end. This rule prevents that architectural rot that happens over time and stops small changes from causing chaos everywhere. Okay, let's move up to the part of the building everyone sees, the front end. And just like the outside of a building, it can't be thrown together randomly. It has to be built methodically, with a really clear separation of its functions and a strict hierarchy. So AR3 is all about the what. It demands 4 functionally separate areas. First, you've got the visual styling, the design. Second, the UI structure, the layout and how things are organized. Third, you have the functions for display and interaction. And finally, you have the specific CRUD logic: create, read, update, delete. The rule is simple. These things must never be mixed together. And if the last rule was about what to separate, AR4 is all about how it's organized. It enforces a strict top-down hierarchy. You start with pages. Each page is then broken down into distinct page sections. And those sections are built from small, modular, reusable UI components. Think buttons, forms, things like that. This structure makes everything consistent and way easier to manage down the line. All right, let's head down to the engine room of the application, the back end. This is where the heavy lifting happens. And just like everything else we've seen, its internal structure is anything but random. It follows a very precise, layered model for handling all the logic and data. AR5 basically defines the backend's assembly line. A request comes in and first hits the API layer, which handles all the routing and versioning. Then it gets passed to the service layer. This is the brains of the operation, where the core business logic lives. Finally, the service layer talks to the repository layer, whose only job is to manage access to the data. It's a clean flow that keeps business logic from getting tangled up with everything else. Okay, for our final section, let's look at the rules that guarantee the whole system holds up over time. You can think of these as the critical plumbing, wiring, and safety codes for our software building. It's all about clean encapsulation and making sure every part of the system is self-contained and behaves predictably. Now, AR6 is an absolute game changer. It says that configuration parameters, things like database URLs or API keys, cannot be just sprinkled throughout the code. The quote says it all. They must never be hard-coded. All of that stuff has to live in its own separate configuration layer. This is what makes an application portable and sane to manage. And this idea of putting things in their own dedicated box just keeps going. AR7, 8, and 9 demand more of it. Database connection logic, it gets its own abstract module. Import and export functions, they need to be their own self-contained services. And the API itself has to be logically structured and versioned properly. You see the pattern here? Every function gets its own clearly defined space. And that brings us to the final rule, AR10, which enforces what is probably the most important separation of all, the hard line between production code and test code. This one is completely non-negotiable. Your production logic must be 100% clean of any test code, and all of your automated tests have to live in their own separate parallel structure. This not only ensures reliability, but it also forces you to build cleaner, more decoupled components from the very beginning. So, let's bring it all home. Structure isn't just a recommendation. It's not a nice to have. For any system that's built to last, that's built for excellence, A rigid structure is the absolute prerequisite. It's the very foundation that allows for scalability, that makes maintenance possible, and that guarantees the longevity of the software you build.